Welcome. We're so glad to have everyone here today. My name's Emile. I'm a program coordinator with Forge. I use they, them pronouns. And I'm just going to give you a brief intro and then pass it off to the lovely team that we have facilitating and training with us today. But I wanted to say, for those who haven't been to a Forge event before, we are a national transgender-led anti-violence organization. We do work to help the helpers, to support service providers and other professionals to best support trans and non-binary survivors of violence and their communities. So we're really excited to be working with JMAC today to talk about mandated support and mandatory reporting, and kind of unpack some of the harms that come with mandatory reporting and what we can do to best support our communities. I'm going to let our trainers and facilitators share more about themselves, their organization, and jump into this work. Please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A throughout for any questions. And we do have ASL interpreters. You can pin your view so that you can see them. They are spotlighted though, so you should be able to have that show up. And Kamaria, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, thanks so much, Emil. Hi, everyone. So great to be with everyone today. My name is Kamaria Excel. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the director of project management for JMACForFamilies. And I don't know if y'all can hear the siren in the background, but like it just started as I started talking. So sorry for any background noise. But yeah, I come to this work really from the reproductive justice space, as well as doing a lot of work with collegiate sexual assault survivors. And so I've been in the violence prevention space, but for the past 3 years have been working closely with JMACForFamilies. Super excited to be here and have this conversation with you all and kind of, yeah, take you through this work that we've been crafting and curating for the past 3 years. So I'll stop rambling on. I'll pass it to Kristen to introduce themselves.
Hey y'all, my name is Kristen Hernandez. I use they, them pronouns. I'm a queer, disabled, Mexican, and Puerto Rican educator, community organizer, and attorney. I'm coming to you all from ceded Lenni Lenape land. I'm very happy to be here with you all, and I'll pass it over to Shalonda to give her intro.
Thanks, Kristen. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shalonda Curtis Hackett, also based in New York on ceded Lenape land. I come through this work through JMAC as an impacted parent, and I currently am the community outreach coordinator at Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem, which is a public defense organization based out of New York. I also come to this work also from a reproductive justice lens as a community-based birth worker. And so I blend the two interconnected spaces together in ensuring that birthers know their rights when they're dealing with hospitals or providers and their children, as well as via education and just basically supporting everyone and knowing what their rights are when they come in contact with a DCFS, a ACS, or a CPS, whatever it's called in your part of this country.
Yes, amazing. Emil has put in the chat to feel free to, drop questions in there, comments. So please do that. We're also 3 very interactive speakers. So we love to vibe and yeah, go ahead and feel free to be interacting with us there. And, we'll keep our eye on the chat to integrate things along the way. So let me go ahead and get us into presentation mode. Here are some of the photos of the work that we have been doing. You'll see Shalonda in many of the photos. But yeah, just wanted to also give some images to the work that we have been doing for the past several years. And just to kind of give a little bit more of where we're going to go today. So we'll start off with like framing this conversation of why we're all here. What is the family policing system? Where is its roots? What is implicated by it? we'll then kind of segue into the role of the social worker or mandatory reporting professional, whichever, kind of profession you're coming to the work through, or if you're a community member, and how, mandatory reporting really impacts our ability to do no harm, to serve and exist safely and freely within our communities. And we'll get into this lovely framing from our colleague Jasmine Wally, the carceral box, and kind of get into the weeds of that. And then we'll kind of end with this forward movement and how do we really on the ground in our communities, in our own interpersonal bodies every day, do the work of mandated supporting. So who are we? We are Just Making a Change for Families, better known socially as JMACForFamilies. And we're a nonprofit org that is committed and dedicated to uprooting and abolishing the family policing system, because we know that there are long existing metrics and systems of community care that have much better, more holistic outcomes than prison systems, foster systems, family policing. And so we're dedicated to proliferating and amplifying those ways of being and existing, which we know our communities have done before and will continue to do during, living in these systems and also in a world after, right? Because we believe through our abolitionist politics that there is a world after where we're all much more safe and free. So how we do our work, we know that this system is interlocking with so many other systems of harm and oppression. And so we really believe in taking a super nuanced approach through advocacy, through policy work, through storytelling, narrative change, programming, healing work within our communities. So yeah, we believe that we kind of got to uproot these systems from multiple different angles, and we're always dedicated to shape-shifting based off of whatever particular work that we're holding space for in that moment. We are also the leader of the Parent Legislative Action Network, the Repeal Capture Coalition, and the Narrowing the Front Door Coalition, which we are all sort of based in New York, but do national work across the country. We were founded by Joyce McMillan, who's our fierce leader, who many folks are probably familiar with in this space, and has been a really instrumental voice across the country for shifting narrative. Shalonda, Kristen, I don't know if there's anything that y'all want to throw into this, who are we? But I'll just take a quick pause. Okay. No, I'm seeing shaking heads. No. Okay, awesome. So to kind of move us then along of kind of, starting the meat and potatoes of why we're here today, I wanted to show this US culture of violence pyramid as a sort of grounding for where we believe the roots of these systems are, right? We know that none of the violences that we see in the world happen in a vacuum, right? They are historically implicated and rooted. And so we tend to focus as a culture and society in these kind of top three parts of the pyramid, right? The orange, the deeper orange, and then the red up top. But really, our work is so focused on holding space for, yes, all the violences that are happening at the top, but also getting into the root causes, which anti-Blackness, the creation of a gender binary and how that was weaponized against Black folks, against Indigenous folks, thinking about colonization as the root cause, patriarchal violence, the influence of science and medicine. Shalonda was also talking about, her work of making sure that birth advocates know their rights that families have. And we know much of our current inequities in the birth space are because of this creation of science and medicine from this colonial lens. And so wanting to really just kind of ground folks in where we're coming from. And yeah, really thinking about how this gender binary, but also just binary systems in general are products of Western thought and colonization, right? There's one way to be a family, which we hear all the time in our work, right? The nuclear family structure is centered as this amazing, awesome way of being. And if you are being raised by grandparents, or if you're being raised by a single parent, or if you're being raised by cousins or just other community members, that is seen as wrong. And much of the creation of a binary is why we exist the way we do now and why we're seeing so many harms across all communities and its system, right, force. So grounding us there, and definitely want folks to kind of meditate on what that means for them and their work. So leaning from that kind of now nuanced understanding of how these systems are formed, from this binary lens, we get the product of family policing, right? Which we define as a system of surveillance, criminalization, and punishment that weaponizes ideas of safety and the threat of family separation to control people's behavior, disproportionately targeting Black, Indigenous, Latine, low-income, queer, and disabled parents. This system includes and is driven by Child Protective Services, also called in New York, the Administration for Family Services, police, mandated reporters, service providers, lawyers, judges, and lawmakers, right? That essentially everyone that can interact with the family is a key player and a part of the reason why families become enmeshed in such a insidious system. We know that family policing is not new, right? That it has its roots in enslavement and separating families on the plantation, sending them to different spaces where they would never see their families again. The history of Indigenous folks being stripped of their homeland, forced migration, mass murder, and assault, right? These are all of the roots of family policing today. And it's continued to shapeshift across history and timelines, right? Oftentimes, I think people feel like this system is new. We can trace the modern legacy of family policing to Captain 1974, which we'll talk briefly about today. But that's kind of a modern start to this iteration of the family policing system, but wanting folks to understand that this is a 400-year-old system that we are existing and continue to resist against the way that our communities always have. So leaning right from that, as we go along, we're adding a little bit more meat with each slide, but you've heard us talk about how reproductive justice is integral to our framework. And so giving, homage to Sister Song, who in the late 90s defined reproductive justice as the human right to maintain in bodily autonomy, to have children, to not have children, and to parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And already, right, hearing about what family policing is, many of you are already working against the system. You know that the mere existence of family policing is at odds with the reproductive justice definition and framework. What ties into our day is also social determinants of health, right? Which we think of about economic stability, your neighborhood safety, education, who has access to clean water, who has access to food that is in alignment with their culture, food that is not necessarily where green spaces are involved, right? We talk about food deserts and the detriments that have happened also to the physical land. And then also the last two kind of metrics of social determinants of health are the community safety piece, right? And then the healthcare system, which we'll tag along to each of these social determinants as we continue to go through our talk and conversation today. Another kind of another super integral key player in this conversation of family policing is Dorothy Roberts, who we've had the pleasure to work very closely with, and is really crucial of really exposing the nature of family policing, its origins. If you've read her book, Killing the Black Body, I feel like it's absolutely necessary reading for everyone who is doing this work, who's not doing this work, who's just interacting with other humans, to have that as a framework. But in her second book, Shattered Bonds, she made the statement that the child welfare system is designed to detect and punish neglect on the part of poor parents and to ignore most middle class and wealthy parents' failings. Although the meaning of child maltreatment shifted from a social to a medical model, it retained its focus on poor families, which we'll kind of get into the weeds of that in a moment. But the system continues to concentrate on the effects of childhood poverty, but it treats the damage as a symptom of parental rather than societal defects. So just to kind of break that down, right? The pathologizing of individual families, right? This family is not meeting a need versus the historical impacts of most of the folks who are wrapped up in the child welfare system, family policing system, are Black and brown folks, right? So what are our histories, right? What are the ways that we have been exploited and harmed historically that of course is leading to this moment where we are the most surveilled? And so thinking about really focusing on shifting from this model of pathology, which is the individual, and saying, no, we live in a harmful system. We live in systems that allow these things to happen versus the individual, families failing. Not to say, right, there is not space to be held for families and the nuances of harm that occurs there, but to really look at the larger system that allows this. And then what you'll see at the bottom is the same snapshot of New York. And as you can see, the intersections between child welfare investigations that are happening in predominantly Black and brown areas are the same areas where child poverty is more rampant, right? And we know that's intentional. We know that's designed. I oftentimes have to catch myself from saying, oh, the system isn't working, right? Versus, no, the system is working perfectly designed the way that it was, right? This system just never has aligned with the reality of living in a world that is free, joyous, and safe for us all. So it's intentional, it's designed, and that's a part of, you know, what we're all gathering today to push back against and shift the narrative on. So I'll pass it to Kristen to get more into the weeds of who are the mandated reporters.
Yeah, thank you, Kamara. I really want to uplift, you know, what you said about the system is working. This system is working as designed to police and surveil our most marginalized communities, right? And mandated reporters and mandated reporting is one of the arms that enables this widespread surveillance of our communities, of our families, right? And so before going into kind of who mandated reporters are, I want to touch a little bit on the system of mandated reporting and what it is, right? And so Kamaria talked about one particular piece of legislation called the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, CAPTA, which required states to have mandated reporting laws and specifically tied funding that states receive to mandated reporting, which are laws that deputize certain categories of professionals to report suspicions of child maltreatment and harm to children by their caregivers and parents, right? And so prior to the enactment of CAPTA, states did have mandated reporting laws, but this really created a national family policing framework that we see in action today that really focuses on punishment and surveillance as opposed to actually providing support and care for families who might need it, right? And so this list right here are categories of mandated reporters in New York. So these are all the folks in New York State that are obligated by law to report suspicions of harm in families. And so that includes medical professionals, school personnel, child care professionals, mental health professionals, law enforcement, right? Whole categories of people who we might normally think of as providing sites of support for families, social service providers, healthcare workers, whose jobs inherently require frequent interaction with children and families for the purpose of providing care. But mandated reporting laws transform these relationships from these potential sites of support into spaces marked by policing and surveillance, actually deterring families from seeking support when necessary. Next slide. So let's take a look at the standards for making a report in New York State, which is where we're based, to help us understand mandated reporting laws and policies. Generally speaking, most states have a reasonable cause standard, right? If you have personal knowledge of a situation that could constitute abuse or neglect, or if you have reasonable suspicion or cause to believe a child is being harmed by a parent or caretaker, mandated reporting laws obligate certain categories of professionals to make reports to child policing agencies, to state registers that all states are required to have in order to be eligible for federal funding. And so breaking this down, reasonable cause is a pretty vague standard, which leaves discretion up to mandated reporters to determine if a report should be made. However, there's a tension between kind of this vague standard and also this legal obligation that imposes penalties on people, including criminal and civil penalties. I believe Florida actually makes it a felony for failing to report if you are a mandated reporter. So these laws also kind of take away a person's ability to exercise their discretion and provide supportive resources for families, and instead incentivizes folks to make report, leading to over-reporting, leading to why this huge amount of people each year across the country that are touched by the family policing system. When we also think about reasonable cause, when we also think about this standard for making reports, it's also important to keep in mind these larger socio-cultural and political factors embedded within the fabric of our ideological system, right? Like how, and thinking about how racism, classism, ableism, transphobia, homophobia impact what reports are made and what's construed as maltreatment, what's construed as harm, right? How does one's individual lived experience shape what we think of and imagine as harm within families, right? Leading folks to making reports that can have disastrous consequences for children and their caregivers. Next slide. Understanding mandated reporting laws and policies. Better safe than sorry. And so what we find is that a lot of folks will be over-inclusive, right? It's better to be safe than to be sorry. Better to report than to not and deal with the what ifs, right? But we know that mandated reporting doesn't further protect children. It doesn't improve the detection of harm, and it doesn't promote access to resources that can support families in legitimate need of support, right? And I think one set of statistics I find incredibly instructive, which is rates of reporting at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, when folks moved away from in-person instruction in schools to remote instruction. And there was this huge fear that that would lead to more harm to children and families. And during that time, we saw a decrease in alleged harm. We saw a decrease in reporting without any corresponding increase in instances of harm or abuse. And so again, talking about how involvement with ACS doesn't make children safer. In fact, children are more likely to experience violence, houselessness, lack of access to healthcare when entering the foster system than they are when they are home, right? Evidence also suggests that mandated reportings decrease the likelihood that families will seek assistance. And what we often find is that families are afraid of reaching out when they do need support, and children are afraid of reaching out when they need support for fear that they will be removed from their homes, for fear of the punitive consequences of saying, like, I need help. Next slide.
Let me make sure that I spotlight myself. Okay, perfect. I'm so glad, Kristen, that you also mentioned, statistics related to COVID, which is a part of even how we started to craft this like mandated supporting curriculum, because I'm sure folks remember in 2020, right, where there were these conversations about, right, we need to defund police. And so in the act of defunding police, we're gonna fund social workers instead. And there was a group of us like, no, actually, social workers mandated reporters function as arms of the carceral state. Like, sure, it looks very different, right, from policing, but the harm is still there, and the harm is still visceral and indescribably painful for families and communities. And so a part of our response to, like, okay, if social work is going to be the answer, if mandated reporters are going to be the answer to any type of solution related to community safety, it's got to be in a way that actually reflects what communities have been demanding and are absolutely deserving of. And so that is how we came up with spinning a mandated reporter into a mandated supporter. And to Kristen's point about like mandated reporting not working, we have data. We've seen studies where it actually shows that mandated reporting is not even an evidence-based practice. There has never been a widespread kind of assessment of the helpful guiding light that mandated reporting is. Instead, we know that community-based interventions, community-based approaches to care are actually proven. There's data behind that. There's not data behind how helpful mandated reporting is, but there's tons of data about how harmful it is, which just shows us the discrepancy, shows us the harm. So just to kind of give a little bit more, we won't get super into the weeds of this information here, but just a little bit more context of mandated reporting as a practice, pre-CAPTA. we're really thinking about how there's always been this like pendulum swing, right? And specifically related to child welfare and the history of it, we see a lot of action that's being taken during the civil rights movement that starts to improve the lived experiences of all families and communities, especially Black folks. However, there is this like pendulum swing in the aftermath of the civil rights movement, sort of, right, a punishment of all of the progress that was happening. And we have folks like C. Henry Kemp, who publishes the battered child syndrome that really describes in very coded language, which to us is not very coded, right? Who are the people that are, quote, abusing their children? And the language that is used, right? The dog whistle politics that are used in that piece, as well as the Moynihan report that comes a few years later, are very, very clearly talking about Black and brown families and communities. And I'll show a second kind of side by side of the article so that you all can see the language, can see the way that this was slowly being planted into the American imagination as a fear thing. Like there are these welfare queens, there are these scary people who are extracting our resources. And if we don't stop this, if we don't stop the harmful people who are abusing their children, they're going to completely take all the resources. There's going to be nothing left. And we know that capitalism and white supremacy loves scarcity, right? That is one of the ways that these systems are able to thrive. Moving on from that to kind of show you this side by side, on the right here, you have, on the left here, you're actually right, will be the Moynihan report. And then on the other side, we have the battered child syndrome. But as you can kind of see these highlighting, most Negro youth are in danger of being caught up in the tangle of pathology, which we kind of talked about in the beginning, right? This individual family pathology as divorce, separation, a female family head, children in broken homes, which we don't even need to do a raise of hands of how much of that language is still operating in the world today. And Angela Davis has this wonderful response piece to the Moynihan report in her book, Race and Class, which I definitely suggest people looking up to hear how she directly approaches this. But one of her points is that Black families have always been torn and separated, right? That is how enslavement was able to keep itself, to shatter the bonds of families and communities. But Black families were able to pivot and still find ways to express care and love, even when being separated onto different plantations. And so this kind of point that Moynihan is trying to drive in about Black mothers specifically being the reason why families are broken and shattered versus, right, the rising of the prison industrial complex, right, as a reason. So this is that pathology again, that individual people, individual Black mothers are the reason for this thing versus the system that has been designed and created to keep families separated and broken. And then on the other side with the battered child syndrome, you see Henry Kemp saying that because of these unstable marriages, right, these people who just can't stay married, this is the reason for sexual promiscuity and minor criminal activities. These are all the reasons why. At the bottom here, I feel like this is always a helpful one to point out, but not infrequent, the beaten infant is a product of an unwanted pregnancy, a pregnancy that began before marriage, too soon, after marriage, or at another time felt too extremely inconvenient, right? So also these tones of like purity culture, right? And emphasis on sexuality, which we would think today we're removed from, but I still work with parents all the time who tell me that caseworkers are asking about their sexual partners and how many people that they've slept with, and asking about the paternal lineages of their children, right? So these are not just things that have disappeared out of thin air. We still are hearing these stigmatizing concepts, these stereotypes to this day. More about how, and literally in the 5 years after Henry Kemp and Moynihan published these pieces, now there's all this like rhetoric in newspaper about conferences on the welfare problem, the welfare mess, Mothers Without Joy, which is particularly a piece to talk about how Black women don't have joy in their lives or with their children, right? So really scathing pieces about Black families and Black communities that then, of course, get perpetuated into other communities. Moynihan sees dependent children as a major issue. Judge suggests jails for unwed mother. Like, y'all, these are real articles and pieces from publications that existed, right? Mothers, warned on illegitimacy of their children, which who's to say who is a legitimate family member or child, right? So always feels important to kind of just show people some of these images and read some of the language so that people can have just a more nuanced understanding of the history and the legacy of some of the harm that we're still, seeing today. So in that kind of pendulum swing pushback of the civil rights movement, we also see that benefits for Black and Latino mothers and women are beginning to be expanded. And then right after we have that brief 5-year period of expansion, boom, the pendulum swings again. And then we have Nixon vetoing a Comprehensive Child Development Act, which would have provided national childcare services, which we know childcare is one of the major reasons why families can get enmeshed in the system. So imagine if you had universal childcare, what ways that would shift the culture. And so of course that is something that Nixon vetoes. And then we have the creation of CAPTA, which Kristen gave some context about, and is one of the issues to this day that we're still fighting. We're all a part of the Repeal CAPTA Coalition because we see CAPTA as a major piece of sustaining this large impact of child welfare. And so one of our desires from CAPTA is obviously a repeal, but in the meantime, to shift funds from Title I, which is your ACS systems, your DCFS, to community-based community organizations, grassroots orgs that know what communities and families need and desire. I'll pause there, Shalonda, Kristen, if any of you want to add some more nuance to CAPTA, feel free to.
Yeah, I'll jump in. This is Shalonda speaking. It's a lot to kind of gather the context of how all of these laws and policy came into place. I will suggest a book called Abusive Policies by McCall Ross, which will detail the historical context in the laws in our country that got us to CAPTA, that's got us to AFTRA, and how that started, and how all of these laws that we still abide by today were written by white supremacists, are developed on white supremacist ideology. And unfortunately, we are still holding on to them from some sort of reason, right? Because I think in the back of everyone's mind, we can kind of get to understand in the criminal legal system, the racism, the injustice. But when it comes to family, when it comes to children, that kind of goes out the window for us in this sort of quest to save children, right? We don't think about people's due process, the actual safety of children, and what's actually happening now. CAPTA has been instituted since 1974, and looking and correlating that to the traumas that are happening to people in foster care and investigations. How is that actually happening? How is that actually serving anyone if what we have now is not working, right? If what we have now is not saving children. So we get a lot of questions about, well, what if this happens? What if a child dies? It's already happening with what we have. And so to dream further, and what would it look like if we based everything in community and not impunity, then what will we have? So that book gives you the context of the laws, who were the players, like Moynihan, like Kemp, who Kemp Center today is now trying to do the work to steer themselves away from their founders' views and ideologies, and how he was so harmful, and how what he did instituted a lot of what we see today. They're trying to move away from that, and which is not as out loud as it was when they were instituted. So it's a quiet sort of rectifying and reconciliation. So the book again is Abusive Policies by McCall Ross, and you can understand where all of this stems from, and it's not stemming from Black mothers can't raise their children. I think the next slide is me. Yeah, so there's a lot of misunderstandings when it comes to what is deemed neglect and need. We know that, at least in New York here, we know that when calls are made through to the SCR, there's a small percentage of those calls that are actually stemming from an alleged abuse situation. A lot of it is stemming from a lack of necessities, a lack or access to medical care, or a child may not be going to school for whatever reason, and mandated reporters are relying on the system here, which is called the SCR, the State Central Registry, to investigate, to deal with the family, and so that they don't necessarily have to, right? We see that happens. So what is misunderstood in these categories, right? Failure to provide adequate food, clothing, and shelter, right? What's the actual need? Provide people with food, housing, and employment, right? That doesn't happen. What we see is that children are removed and placed into foster care or in foster homes, and then those people are given money, food, shelter to provide for those children instead of giving it to their actual caregivers. Failure to provide medical or mental care. What is that? Lack of access to health care. We all know how hard it is in this country to get adequate health care and support. And when you do that, and when you do seek support, and you share with that provider a struggle and a need, that can be weaponized against you. So another one, failure to support a child's educational needs by keeping a child home from school for unexcused reasons. I've also seen that weaponized here as well, especially during the pandemic, when a lot of Black and Brown families were leery of getting COVID shots based on historical reference or medical needs. Schools were calling in ACS cases on parents. Schools were also calling in ACS cases on parents for not having the adequate technology, which they were supposed to provide. And so there were no mechanisms for parents to call in and say, my child still not has received their device, their iPad or whatever it is. But schools were calling in saying the child is not logging on, knowing that they were the reason why the child wasn't able to have technology, nor were they provided with internet service. So that's another thing. So I saw someone in the chat state that, mandate reporting is a way for people to pass the buck to someone else and to a different agency. And that is 100% true. I'll just go through maybe one or two more. So subjecting a child to humiliation, fear, verbal terror, or extreme criticism, right? So there's unresolved generational trauma there. There's an unmet mental health need, and it could be a projection of workplace treatment, right? So we do acknowledge that harm happens, but how do you meet today's eyes? We meet harm with more harm, right? We compound the trauma versus actually getting to the root of what it is and providing a family with what they need and allowing them to stay together if that is in their best interest. What we often see in the work that I do with clients is that children are stripped from the only place that they know. They're placed with strangers, and they are stripped from everything from their community, their culture, and then they're working their ways back. And then if that child is returned home, the state wipes their hands clean of them. They're not provided with additional resources for the trauma that they experience. They're not provided with the medical needs, the mental health services. And so to me, what is the point of us doing this if at the end of the day, we are just going to leave people more damaged and more harm than where they started? You can go to the next one. And so what we see now, unfortunately, in our country and in states like Florida, is that abuse is now being used and weaponized against families who are providing their children with gender affirming care. It is now deemed as neglect and abuse. And the state has given mandated reporters this weapon, which I call a weapon of mass destruction, a way to put their views on at a hierarchy than what the child actually needs. Their views, which doesn't have anything to do with them personally, is now superseding what the child may need medically, mentally, and physically. And so we see that often, and parents and youth are fighting. They are not lying down and allowing these laws to stop them from receiving the care that they need. You can go to the next
I have a couple of things to add if you
one.
don't mind.
Yep.
And so I think so the two articles on the screen refer to Greg Abbott in 2022 notoriously ordering that parents who support their children in receiving gender affirming care be investigated for abuse and child maltreatment. Texas courts enjoined this directive, meaning it's been put on pause. However, there's still active litigation to determine the outcome of this directive. Texas and anti-trans legislation across the country, specifically targeting trans youth dignity and survival in schools, in their homes, and with respect amongst medical providers, reveal the intersections between the movement for trans justice and the way that the family policing system is weaponized to criminalize and target trans communities. There's also just a disjuncture between attacks against the trans community and trans youth access to life-saving care and support, and attacks against parental autonomy, because a lot of anti-trans legislation is justified under the guise of parents' rights. However, nationally, and as we've been discussing, parental rights and parents' ability to make decisions regarding their children's safety and well-being is directly undermined through the family policing system, which operates through what Dorothy Roberts describes as the guise of benevolence. There's also another dimension that we want to acknowledge, right, which is the very real harm that does happen in families. There's one report from 2019 which revealed that 44% of LGBTQ plus youth in the family policing system in state custody were targeted or were involved in the family policing system for reasons directly related to gender identity and sexual orientation, right? We have to acknowledge the very real prevalence of homophobia and transphobia within communities, and specifically, that are fueled by anti-trans rhetoric and legislation, which touch the roots of Western imperialism, as Kamari discussed earlier, right? Transphobia is baked into the fabric of Western colonial identity. Family policing and further policing does not address those root causes. We know that outcomes for trans and LGBTQ plus youth, generally outcomes for LGBTQ plus youth in foster care are horrific. LGBTQ plus youth in foster care face higher risks of victimization, violence, discrimination, abuse. In NYC, some 78% of LGBTQ plus youth were removed or ran away from foster homes because of the violence they had been facing, right? LGBTQ plus youth are more likely to age out of the foster system without finding permanent placement, are more likely to be in congregate settings or group homes as opposed to home-based placement, are at higher risk of suicide and mental health, exacerbated mental health, right? We also know that agents within the family policing system also carry the same anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ biases that are reflected within our larger ideological world, right? The family policing system is very ill-equipped to actually address then the needs of LGBTQ plus youth. And when the family policing system does become involved in families, they don't have the supportive services necessary to really effectuate healing, right? And removal and the threat of removal also completely forecloses the opportunity for youth, for trans youth, to be able to have some kind of healing or reparative relationship with their families. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about strategies to reduce harm in our later slides, but we just wanted to highlight, right, further policing is not the answer.
Okay.
Is this my slide?
I was like, I think it's either me or you, Shalana. I think it's you though.
It gets me cool. So the impacts of mandated reporting. So there are a lot of impacts, but we're going to focus in on the family as a whole, and then the impacts of the mandated reporter. So mandated reporting sows distrust, right? And so it eliminates or limits the family's ability to feel safe and get support. I can personally say that that's exactly what it is. I have a 100% distrust in the Department of Education, because when someone called an anonymous report on my family, I knew it was malicious. I knew exactly where it came from. And I also knew that I couldn't do anything about it because they decided to call it maliciously. Now, the difference here is that, and I want to state this, we've trained people as mandated reporters with all this knowledge and all this language to identify abuse and neglect, but we never thought that they would possibly use it violently, right? So here in the state of New York, they have the option, people have the option, regardless if they're a mandated reporter or not, to use the anonymous tip line, right? So we have given people a loaded weapon with no recourse. There's no way to identify who they are. It's no way to go back and hold them accountable for the lies that they tell the state central registries. And unfortunately, they can continue to do it over and over and over again. And myself, my family have no recourse. The last thing I was told by an ACS worker was that, well, if you know who it is, you can go confront them. Let's sit with that and make that make sense, that I go out during a pandemic and go confront who I think called in a malicious report on my family. What would that then do, right? That would garner more surveillance, more policing on myself and my family. And so I state that to say that mandated reporting, in the way that it is given in trainings, is always from a state of carcerality. It's never from a state of support. And so for years, if you have someone who's a teacher for 25 years, who at a yearly training have been told these parents are bad, look for this, look for that, look for these things, and never told how to support or help, that's the only thing that they're going to look for. And on the flip side of that, if someone decides that they don't like the child, they don't like the parents, they don't like their situation, they have an unlimited resource to go ahead and call in. And they know that what they've been trained to say is going to have much more weight than possibly a neighbor. Saying things like maltreatment and abuse and sort of and framing a call has much more weight than someone who just is like, oh, they don't feed them kids. Like, that's different. And so the state of mandated reporting as it is today gives people too much power over people who are ill-informed about their rights. It leads to an invasive investigation. And most in this state here in New York, the initial investigation, depending on how severe the call is, could be 60 days. I've read where it's 10 months in some states, and where everything is through a fine-tooth comb. Even if that's not the reason why the caseworker is coming in, they will pick up and try to pick up on something else. It impacts autonomy in parenting, in prenatal and postnatal care. Here in New York State, our governor, one governor removed, said that parents have a right to not give their newborns vitamin K and the eye ointment. To this day, if parents don't know that that's a memorandum of understanding between the states and our hospitals, their doctors can call ACS. Will our state central registry pick it up? We don't know who's going to pick up that call, but we do know that there is a memorandum of understanding that no one should be calling just for that reason. But again, when people don't know that their rights, or don't know that this exists, it leaves this window of opportunity to call in cases on families that is very unwarranted. It deepens the cycle of trauma generationally. I've said before, and I stated this on my NBC interview, that if you're Black, you're ACS adjacent. If you are not affected personally by ACS, which is here, you know someone's aunt, someone's grandmother, And what people don't realize is that that sticks with that person for the rest of their lives. If there is a situation where there is a child that needs to go to kinship care, if that family member had a case in 1980, it will affect whether or not that child can go into that home. They are not a viable resource anymore because they've had policing involvement. And so these cycles to keep us in the frame of where we are is martyred by this mandated reporting. I've seen plenty of families want to take in a child, a nephew, and they can't because they're trying to get their names removed from this system. As easy as it takes to get your name onto the system, it takes so much to get your name off. People have to legally fight for their names to be removed off the SCR. It violates reproductive justice. Here in New York, we have a law that we want to get passed called informed consent, and ensuring that our hospitals are not violating birthers' rights to not consent to drug testing. What ends up happening is that instead of giving care, ACS is called. ACS is not the space to provide care if someone is a substance user. They need support, not to have their baby stripped away from them. And we know that ACOG and pediatricians always state that if there is an issue of substance use, the best care is rooming in, skin to skin. So these particular policies and laws go against what's actually holistically necessary and needed. So even with mandated reporters, and some people feel that their intent is good, it also limits their ability to provide the actual support because there's this sort of like pecking order of what it is. Some people follow it, and we have some people who are like, I'm a mandated reporter, but I refuse to report because they know the detriment and the harm and the impact that it has. It deepens one's commitment to practice that are contradictory to their own ethics. I say this all the time, like policies are highly different from what our intuition is and what we would do in our own families. Would we call on our mother? Would we call on our sister? Would we call on our brother? Or what would we actually do? Go in and provide that support. There's the moral injury. I didn't become a pediatrician to become a police officer, right? That's what the highlight of their job is every day. We know that in the medical space, depending on the assurance you have, you got about a 15-minute window of time with your doctor. But if that doctor is only assessing and speaking to you to find out what's wrong and how they can call on you, then how is that the Hippocratic oath of providing care? Like, none of it is caring at this moment. And also it undermines the scope of our role from supportive to surveillance. This is why people don't share. If you have a person, for example, who had their child taken away from them at 18 and they decide for whatever reason, and they decided to have children at 26, they still have that memory and that trauma, and more than likely often do not seek care. They don't, because they know that at any given moment, if my history is going to decide whether or not I can care for my new child, why would I go into these spaces? And so it's a very carceral code and way of instituting what will be considered support. So here's some statistics as the impact continues. 40% of women reported that they would less likely to seek DV support services if they knew a report would be made. 51% of DV survivors said that mandatory reports made their situations a lot worse. We've had people tell us, and other people kind of have this conversation with people who call for domestic violence. If the person tells you that they're not in a safe space and they are living with the person that is not a safe space, if you decide to send a caseworker to that home at 2:00 in the morning, and you say this is a domestic violence situation, you are leading to more harm. It doesn't solve the situation. It doesn't support the person. 61% of DV survivors said they minimize disclosure to service providers as a result of reporting warnings. And what we also find is that majority of the time, the person who is perpetrating the violence is not removed from the home, but the child is, right? And the mother is then having to fight for her rights to see her children in court because she decided that she wanted to seek support. We see this all the time. We see this in court cases in which parent alienation is a topic, and children being removed and sent to camps to kind of brainwash them into wanting to be back with their abuser. We see this a lot. And so these are just some statistics. 82% of families reported that Child Protective Service involvement made their situation much worse than what they thought, and no different. What I'll also say to this too is that we've gotten to a point where we're just ping-ponging a ball back and forth. I've seen children, unfortunately, weaponize this against their parents. And what they didn't realize in the beginning is that they thought they were going to go somewhere nicer, I guess, and assume. And I've had a lot of clients and their children's try to go back home, and they can't, because according to the court order, you can't go home. It has to be decided by a judge that you can go home. We've seen parents who make their children go to school. The child is then removed and then sent to a foster care place or a home where that foster parent doesn't care if they go to school or not. And so the child ends up worse. We have clients who children started on the honor roll and going to therapy, and they no longer do that anymore. Those things are not a priority. So my thing is, if ACS, Child Protective Services, what we call family policing, is supposed to be better than what the parent is doing, why are the statistics the way that they are? Why are the children ending up in far worse situations than what they are? We have colleagues who speak of their own experiences of molestation, abuse, things that they weren't removed for. They were removed for food inequities and equalities. They were removed for a housing situation, and then they were put into a situation that mentally and physically far more worse than where they were.
Kristen speaking, if I might add, Shalonda, or kind of underscore something that you were talking about with respect to intimate partner violence and interpersonal violence, right? Like thinking of the autonomy of survivors of harm and violence, right? To make decisions for themselves and make decisions with respect to what relationships they also might want to work towards healing and repair in, right? It's completely foreclosed by a court system that mandates or that forces parents to show compliance in order to keep their children home, right? And so like from the perspective of survivors, being able to actually make choices consistent with their wants, their needs with respect to relationships that involve violence, right? Like we see the autonomy of folks undermined nonstop.
That's me again, Shalonda. Holding space, right? So our roles as providers must shapeshift based off the needs and desires of the family. We are space holders, which mean we should constantly be reshaping how we show up for families and their communities. This comes from deep active listening and decentering ourselves. We are not saviors, reframing our role to truly do no harm. As a birth worker, this is one of the frameworks that is my foundation. I cannot go and say I'm going to support a family in how they want to birth and then evoke my my authority over them because I have a little bit more knowledge of how the space works. It's also my duty to also ensure that providers don't do that in a space. And making sure at the center of that is this family, is this birther, is this child, and not what they want, right? Because unfortunately, we have people with white coats and education thinking that they know more for what people want than the actual people in their own bodies. As a community outreach coordinator here in Harlem and working with people directly, I'm always actively listening and seeking and vetting providers and services, because that's another thing too. We want to do the best, but sometimes these providers that are contracted by these state agencies do more harm than good. They don't provide the actual therapies that people need. They rubber stamp things, or they make the situation worse, or they weaponize the person's mental health against them. So I think my duty as a community outreach coordinator is not to just compile a list of all the places, but to vet the places that I'm sending families to, so they can actually receive the services that they're looking for. I don't think this is my slide.
This is my slide. So the next couple of slides is to really think through some skills that hopefully folks can take with them in thinking about how we can mitigate the harms of mandated reporting, how we can reduce the harms that we ourselves have the potential to cause when we make reports, right? And also like how we can support young people, how we can support families in getting the supports that they need without involving punitive systems. So some things to remember and some things to think about, right? Intervention does not equal help. CPS investigation does not ensure that a family's needs will be met, nor is it really designed to ensure that a family's needs will be met. You know, as Shalonda discussed in some of the cases that she's worked on, and in the experiences that we have, right? Like a lot of families have to fight for the little support that they do get through these systems, have to fight tooth and nail to get things like diapers, money for food, help with furniture, help to accomplish the things that the Child Protective Service system requires them to do in order to have their children returned to them, right? An ACS visit to a family's home is both invasive and traumatizing. I do also want to drop some stats with respect to ACS investigations nationally. If I can pull those up, which I may not be able to. Okay. So in 2021, nationally, there were over 3.9 million reports alleging harm to children by parents and caregivers. I believe some 76% of those were by mandated reporters. After the calls were made and were vetted, and of the calls that were investigated, 80% were cleared of any wrongdoing, but these families had to undergo incredibly invasive and traumatizing investigations where every detail of their home is scrutinized. Children can be searched and asked to disrobe by strangers to be assessed for marks or bruises. Child policing agents will go through people's cabinets, will get access to medical records, right? These are very, very, very invasive investigations. So something to remember before making a call, right, is the impact those investigations can have. These investigations are a form of state surveillance. When child policing agents come to a family's home, right, they're looking for evidence that can be used against parents in potential litigation. They're looking for proof to substantiate a case that could potentially be filed, right? And CPS, child protective investigations, also have a domino effect, meaning they can lead to eviction, immigration consequences, job loss, among other things, right? Another thing to think about before calling a family policing agency or so-called child protective agency is, right, what resources do I have at my disposal that I could potentially connect a family with or connect a young person with? What community-based organizations exist that can potentially get involved to provide support to a family? And then what are resources that I personally have within my within the scope of my professional expertise that I can utilize to support a family, including education, including offering to meet with young people and their families, including offering educational resources for families, right? All of these things we're hopeful folks can think about as we move into our work, right, to kind of prevent having to make these phone calls. Next slide. And then, after going through that assessment, right, thinking through what to do if you must make a call to a family policing agency. So some questions to ask yourself, right? Have I included the parent or caregiver in decision-making and reporting process, right? What information have you given to a parent before making a phone call? Are you telling the parent that you are making that call, right? How are you also involving young people who are impacted by these phone calls in this decision-making process, right? Moving away from anonymity to kind of an having open and transparent dialogues around kind of the suspicion of harm and what can be done, and what could potentially be the outcome, right, if something isn't resolved, which would be a phone call, right? Have I exhausted every other option available to me? Look into those resources, do some Googling, reach out to colleagues, reach out to other members in your community to figure out what other options there are, what other resources exist. Did I inform the family of their rights? Did I connect the family to a legal advocate, right? This bullet point includes very New York City specific information, right? These are some public defender offices that adopt holistic models to family advocacy, right? That we often will recommend parents and families that we work with to reach out to, but do some research, look into what kinds of legal support there could be for parents, and legal support there could be for young people, and trying to do that extra work of connecting folks to legal advocacy to make sure that their rights are protected. Excuse me. Am I giving a holistic, reasonable account of the family situation and strengths, right? Part of that assessment process. Have I processed the situation again and consulted trusted help before making this decision? And then,
Yes.
oh,
I was gonna do this one.
you got it.
Shalonda speaking. So making the call in a way that mitigates harm. So if you truly think that there is a benefit by calling your state agency for support, and calling that agency outweighs the trauma of an investigation or removal, here are just some steps, right? But could never eliminate, the harm. So like we said, involving the family, ideally you would make the call with them. If it's really about support, why is it made in secrecy? Why is it made unbeknownst to them? Because I know what it feels like to have a random stranger call your phone and show up to your home and you don't even know why it's happening. And so if there's an actual need there, why not make the call with that person? We also request that the operator repeat everything back that you say, right? And confirm that they are repeating it accurately. There are some inaccuracies in the way that things are reported and stated. So ensuring that your words and the facts that you have are what they actually are. And then highlighting the family strengths and protective factors, and then seeking that legal support, and help educating families on what their rights are. Every state should have a legal support there, whether it's a private lawyer or, in our case here in New York and a lot of other states, there are public defense organizations. A lot of them do what is called early defense. What people don't realize either is that a lot of these ACS cases don't even get to court because parents are complying with orders to mitigate mitigate removal. And so they're conceding basically to state, I'll do these things in order to keep my children. And oftentimes it's services that they don't actually need. And so with early defense help, what that lawyer or that social worker can do is be on the phone when ACS comes in and be able to mitigate any questioning that happens, and make sure that that person is not divulging a whole lot of information that's unnecessary or not pertaining to the actual allegation. Also, people knowing their rights. We have cards that states you don't have to let ACS into your home without a warrant. You don't have to speak to them. It is your right not to subject yourself to a drug test. Those are all the things that you have a right to stop. You're still also protected by Fourth Amendment. For some reason, this country has this belief when it comes to families and the family policing system that they can trample over everyone's Fourth Amendment right. That is not the case. You are still protected by the Fourth Amendment. And what would be helpful is having that legal support. Even when you get that legal support, don't solely rely on that, right? Educating ourselves with what our rights are, even with legal representation. Because unfortunately, we do have some lawyers who don't do their jobs very well and will do the same thing that ACS says. Just to make this easier, just comply. And unfortunately, it's not going to change if we continue to keep complying to the violations of our rights. And so this is why we do things like this. And this is why I do know your rights trainings beyond know your rights. You have to know that if I can't stop an investigation, if I can't stop going to court, what is it that I need to know to continue to fight for my rights and keep my children as long as possible or get them back? Here in New York, it's called a 1028 or a 1027, that if a child is removed, your lawyer can go directly in. It's supposed to be within a few days of that removal, and the judge is supposed to hear why their removal was unjust. And a lot of people have won their 1027s and 1028s and have had their children returned to them within 24 to 72 hours. And so that's a right that people have as well. So I don't know all the states' legalities around fighting, but they are there. Things are instituted for us to fight. We just don't know about them. So knowing what happens after a call, I think this is a big piece and a chunk that's missing from people who think that they're calling in good faith, and think that automatically services are going to be rendered, and that and then that the caseworkers or the agency is going in with care and not accusing. Know that every time you make a call, the parent is guilty. The parent, the caregiver, has to work themselves out of a guilty assumption. We are not innocent. We are told that our children are malnourished. We are told that our children are neglected, and we have to prove that they aren't. Here in New York, they're like two tracks. So depending on the severity of the case, some families are pushed towards what's this part of the agency called CARES. So they say, we're just investigating. You don't have any involvement with ACS prior to this. And so we just want to ask questions and speak with you. It's still an investigation at the end of the day. And what you say in that investigation will be used to determine whether or not they want to take you to court. So you still have to treat it just as much as a regular investigation. And so, and again, anything that a caregiver uses against them says will be used against them. So the call is made. Either the report is accepted or it's not accepted by the SCR. Here in New York, our SCR is like in upstate. So all the calls that are made about New York City specifically go upstate. So it's in a town with people that don't look like us, don't understand us, are deciding whether or not the call is substantial enough to then trickle back down into the city and county agencies for them to pick up and then make a call or come out to someone's home. So that local ACS field office will also decide to pick it up or not. Then after the parent is investigated, which can be upwards of 60 days, within that time frame, the report can be indicated or unfounded. Here in New York, you are still entitled to receive legal support, which is called early defense. I say if there's early defense in every state, everybody, as soon as ACS makes that phone call, you hang up and you call your local public defense organization, because at least they can walk you through what the process is, and you have someone who is supposed to be on your side walking you through that. After that, right, there could be, if the report is indicated, there could be court intervention. ACS can file the neglect petition. They can take a couple of actions, court order supervision, and the child remains in the home, or the removal and the court order supervision, and that's a longer process. We still have clients who have been fighting to get their children back for upwards of seven years. And so that's a long, drawn out process, which I don't think people understand. People think that, oh, if you're in family court, you're guilty. That's not true. It's basically ACS has provided enough information that it's probable that this thing happened. Doesn't mean that it's true. What also happens is what I was saying before, that there is no court intervention, the child remains in the home, but then preventative services, quote unquote, are put into place. So basically, the caregiver has decided to do, let's say, anger management, or go into treatment, or go into counseling. Those are the things that end up happening when there's technically no court intervention, and where a majority of a lot of these cases go. And then if the report is unfounded, you have if the report is unfounded, your name is still a part of the SCR, even though it's sealed. What I did in my case was that I requested those documents, and there are two separate documents. There are the case notes, so those are the actual notes that the caseworker has written, and then there's the SCR report. I requested both of those things so I could have a copy and read what was said about me, because a lot of those things in there were, fabricated and untrue to a point where it made it seem like I agreed to a lot of things, which I adamantly didn't. And then the other part is when a report is indicated, there's what's called an emergency removal. So the child is removed without a court order. CPS will come with the police. And so then a petition must be filed within 24 hours. And ACS required to notify parents of their legal rights, and it does not happen. When a petition is made, it's often not made in 24 hours as well. We've had cases where person who a case is indicated on or is called on is called a respondent. And you may have a parent who's the non-respondent. We've seen where the roles have reversed, and the person who the child has went with is now the respondent, and now they have to fight their way. And ACS will say, well, we're going to file a petition on you, and you need to be ready. We have a client right now that's been waiting for a petition to be filed for 3 weeks. So it's like, y'all don't even have the evidence or anything to file. Y'all just are wanting to snatch kids away from parents, or have these parents in limbo about their lives, because you are trying to build a case around them. And so understanding your family's rights. There's a lot of education around what your rights are per state. These particularly, which cover pretty much every state, which through my research and reading and trying to, stay abreast on how the differences and the overlaps in many states, they're pretty much the same, but you can always look up what families' rights are pertaining to your particular state. But we must keep the health and well-being of families in mind, and they often lack the power and opportunities to form a rebuttal against reports. A few families know their rights when they're interacting with ACS. And so organizations like JMACForFamilies, in Florida, there's Mining for Gold. In North Carolina, there's Operation Stop CPS. There is MJ, I can't remember MJ's organization out in Colorado, but Malika Jaheed is a LMSW who's working alongside families to prevent a lot of these investigations from even happening. And so the basics of your rights are, you don't have to speak to ACS when they knock, or let them into your home, or allow them to speak to your children if they don't have a court order. Sometimes, depending on the circumstances, this is what we say to parents, is that you have to do what's in your best interest. But with that, know what your rights are within that. We've had families just meet them outside the front door and not let them into the home. They wanted to see the baby. I've had a family show the baby, put their baby up to the door, like, see, baby's fine, and put their baby back in the home, and work with a legal organization to keep mitigating any intrusive entries into the home. You don't have to answer ACS questions. And you're allowed to talk to a lawyer or a legal advocate. I will say this with questions. Sometimes we want to defend ourselves so bad that we throw ourselves right under the bus. We say too much when the least is required at this stage of an investigation. You don't have to say, oh, yes, I used to use marijuana, but it doesn't bother me now. Like, that's it. What is the allegation? Stick to what the allegation is and keep it as simple as that. You have a right to know the nature of the allegation. They must tell the person what the allegation is for before even going any further. You don't have to reveal any private information, any mental health diagnoses, none of those things. Because again, unfortunately, in this country, we weaponize mental health, we weaponize intellectual disabilities, we weaponize gender. Everything is weaponized against us in order to break down our communities. And so again, I understand how it feels to want to defend yourself. I felt like I was defending myself. And in hindsight, I was like, why did I say all of that? It was very unnecessary. And while I had an unfounded case, I did walk through this alone. If I knew then what I knew now, I wouldn't even have had let them come into my home at the time that they did. And so you have a right to actually access preventative services on your own. You don't have to choose the ones that the agency provides for you. I would go that route than having them, because all of those service providers are contracted by them. So whose side are they actually on at the end of the day? And so here, ensuring that families have the opportunities of their legal rights. Again, this is like New York based, but again, look up where the legal supports are. There are a lot of people that actually do pro bono work as well, and they do sliding scale. I would say if you have to walk through this, do it with a legal support.
Mari speaking. My apologies, y'all. The slides are over here. I'm trying to put stuff in the chat. I'm switching the slides. So sorry, Shalonda, that it was like funky on you towards the end. Let me get my spotlight. Is that me? Add spotlight. Okay, perfect. I was trying to type this in the chat just now, but for the Ohio folks, someone has put a Ohio resource. I, in this moment, don't have any readily available, but that is something that I will get to Emil and the team to send out to you all, with the slides and everything. So thanks y'all for sharing such good information in the chat. I've been trying to keep up, but it's a little difficult, but keep the thoughts flowing. Shifting from, knowing parents knowing their rights. And one of the things that I think is so important, especially as we get into this carceral box framing, right? We have things that are within the carceral box that we know don't work, right? The carceral box is a system that we have now, and everything on the outside is ways that communities can come together to begin to do this work of what Shalonda so beautifully calls freedom dreaming, and even, held a series last year of community just coming together to say, what else can this thing look like? And it a lot of times it comes from gathering too. Even our whole Know Your Rights campaign, that is something that was crafted in our first HEAL cohort. And Shalonda was one of the people people need to know their rights. We need to have this as a tangible resource that people can have. And a couple years later, it's something that we're actively doing within community, sharing with loved ones. And so even just gathering, collecting, sharing information and knowledge is a part of how we divest and reduce the impact of these systems. But someone mentioned it, I want to say it was somebody by the name of Amanda, mentioned liability in the chat, which is so important to think about. How often is it something that we really have to do, or are we afraid of the liability, right? Is it really, do we really have to call, or are we afraid of, the implications of what we think is going to happen because of a call being made, right? Like the compliance of it all, the fear that people have of stepping outside of this carceral box, which to validate that it is scary, right? We are told that this is the right way, that families are wrong and they're doing bad things, and right, like all the other rhetoric that we've been talking about today, right? Like we hear that so much that feeds into our own imagination to be able to create something else or to do something else. The reality is, right, like we know that both the 10% of folks who are experiencing actual tangible harm are getting support, and then the like 90% of folks who are there because of poverty related concerns, it's not serving anyone, right? And the thing is, like, if someone is hungry, how much easier would it be to just give them food, right? If someone needs access to clean clothes, clean laundry, how much easier would it be to provide that need? And what we often say is, because the system is so saturated with people, that if our systems just look different, if we improve their material needs and concerns, we could actually focus on the people who are experiencing that tangible harm. I dropped New Beginning Collaboratives in the chat, but they are one of the folks that have really been, over the past couple of years, trying to think of community and holistic approaches to childhood sexual abuse and childhood sexual assault. It's like we spend so many resources on folks who are, who yes, need support, but the other people who are experiencing real tangible harm, right? Like we don't even have enough creative capacity or energy to think about interventions that might support. So other things in this box, once again, that pathology, which comes up, the isolation, interlocking systems, deficiency-oriented language about what people don't have, right? We hear so much of that. Or there's a need here, there's a lack here, versus like, well, what do communities have? Like many of the things that are outside of the carceral box, communities are already doing in smaller ways, right? It's like, how can we shift funding? One of the things that we're in support of here in New York is the Child and Family Wellbeing Fund, which once again, similar to our approach to CAPTA, would shift those funds from ACS systems into community organizations that are on the ground that already know. So outside of this box is resource mapping, identifying the informal structures, right? Which I put quotes on that because these are formal structures that communities use every day to stay alive. So your carpooling systems, your community raising circles and kitchens, conversations that happen in beauty shops and barber shops, right? Like that real work of how community shows up for each other, providing funding for those things, right? If your org gets funding, resisting the urge to be like, oh, we're the experts, we know all the things, so we're gonna start this initiative. It's like, what does the community even want, right? Because oftentimes from this professional lens, we're doing things that is not even in alignment with the need of a community. So if you get funding, if you get material resources, to resist the urge to hoard that within your organization and to share that out with the community. I think Kristen mentioned this earlier, but like being survivor-centered, right? Like, and that means listening to survivors. It means listening to survivors who are young, and we tend to invalidate the experiences of young people and think they don't know what's best for their lives, but really listening and making decisions based off of what a survivor is saying, which sometimes might go against what you think you know or what you think would be best for them. But the reality is, right, like we are not in folks' bodies, we're not in folks' families and communities. And so being able to decenter, right, that like ego that I think is so wrapped up in, and I'm a social worker by training, so the social work profession, but whatever profession you're coming from. Shalana's mentioned informed consent related to, unconsensual drug testing in hospitals of birthing folks, but also just informed consent with calling, making a call in general, whether it's in the hospital or not, but just like the concept of not notifying people of what is about to drastically shift their life. What is one day in the office for you is a lifetime for a family, whether separation happens physically or not, right? Just the pure act of having someone go through your cabinets, write things like laundry was undone, or write things like laundry unfolded, to look in your refrigerator. Like, why is all of that necessary? I don't think we even question the going into the home enough. And then, finally, we talk a lot in social work about like harm reduction and like all these theories of evidence-based practice. This profession is so proud of that, but we are constantly upholding something that we literally know has no evidence, right? And then thinking about this whole concept of imagination and creativity, getting really generative about like what the world could look like. What do families and communities look like in the future? Who is there? What are they doing? And then how do we slowly start stretching across to that future, which happens right in these spaces like we're facilitating today. So I'll pause, Shalonda, because then any things inside the carceral box, outside of it, y'all want to throw in there?
No, you're good.
Okay. Let me see. There was someone in the chat that just, yeah, laundry unfolded equals clean laundry. Yeah, like this like little right things that we do to surveil families that are absolutely ridiculous that we would never want anyone coming into our home and doing. Shifting from that, like more of what's outside the carceral box, but things that we know actually work. It's not like we have no models. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We could look at several social justice movements historically that have given us beautiful, monuments, blueprints of like what the world can look and exist like. So we can reach back for those, but also like in our current reality, we know that the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit that many families received over the pandemic significantly reduced reports of child maltreatment. Why? Because when people have their material needs met, right, there's less interaction and interfacing with systems. We know that poverty is deeply disorienting to folks' systems, to folks' reality, and having to always live, and this is right, like my therapy mode coming up, but always having to live in this space of survival, of scarcity, and that being passed down generationally. And yeah, when people have funding, when people have access to what they need, we see a difference. Childcare subsidies reduce reports of child maltreatment. Those informal networks that I've talked about, when you have a babysitter, when you have somebody to watch children, right? When you have to go to work, like all of those things matter. Thinking about the Nixon veto we talked about earlier, right? Access to quality and comprehensive gender affirming care, as shown by some wonderful organizations, Folks Health, which I want to say now they're national across the country. I think I just saw that on the Instagram last week. Plume Health and Tia Health, all beautiful organizations that offer like, yes, not just access to HRT, but also mental health services for trans and queer communities. We know that these are things that are literally proven to improve the experience of people's realities and prevent them from harm, right? Providing folks with safety nets, tangible safety nets that they can access. Increase minimum wage by $1, just $1, reduce reports of child maltreatment by 10%. Also, that's a whole nother tangent about minimum wage and how much it actually costs to live in our culture, and the fact that minimum wage is not even close to cutting that. But just thinking, even if we kept that framework, right, of minimum wage, just increasing it by $1 could significantly increase people's experience within their families and communities. And then 30% of foster children could be home right now if their family had adequate housing. And that is like, yes, it's a statistic, but I think we could all share examples of families that we know right now, have known in the past, where that is just a part of their barrier. It's like they can't get their child home because they don't have stable housing, but they can't get stable housing because all of these other factors. And so there's so many things that can be happening in the now that have to do with budget shifts, right? A shift of money, which we know that's the language of these systems that we live under. But there are things that exist in the now as we try and get to that future world. But I'll pause. I know there's some stuff in the chat, but also, yeah, someone saying outrageous about $1. I absolutely think that is, yeah, just the wildest thing. Kristen, Shalonda, anything for what actually works? Okay, beautiful. In our last, like, we're kind of at that ending 30-ish minute mark or less. Just wanted to share some reflection questions that folks can, we'll give 5 minutes to kind of do that within your own interpersonal body. We've been talking a lot. We've been sharing a lot of information, a lot of rich, discussion in the chat if folks have been keeping up there. But just kind of want to hold space for folks to take a pause, take a deep breath, because this has all been, right, like really rich discussion, but to also like start to think about some of these questions. And I encourage folks taking these into their agencies, into their communities, within their own families, right? I know there's much work to be done on all levels of how we approach and talk about harm, but just to kind of read these out loud in the space. The first one is, how will this framework impact my organization? And how will my agency feel about this, right? Like even bringing up a mandated supporting lens is often seen as very radical. In our mind, these are just basic human necessities, right? But we know mentioning things like this gets people really scared, right? And really panicky. Are there people in my organization that can support with this transition, right? Like who could you talk to leverage a conversation about the practices that your agency is conducting? What resources do I need to be more connected with that our agency can live up to the mandated supporting framework? Obviously now you have another resource in JMAC. The next one here, how can we support clients without relying on systems, right? That's that generative, that's that creative process coming through. And then what are my personal definitions of care, community, and ultimately support? Like, why are you doing this work? Which I ask myself every day, like, who is this in service to? What am I doing, right? And I think it's so important to have that reminder for ourselves so that we can stay grounded in why we're doing this work. We can stay grounded in what I would define as a deep love ethic for communities and families that look like me and that don't look like me. So, that's something that I would reflect on in that last question. But I'll just give folks 5 minutes. It's 4:05. We'll, take 5 minutes until 4:10. We'll, if folks have questions that they want or things they want to respond to, for these questions, you can put them in the chat, and then we'll, spend our last couple minutes trying to answer some of these Q&A questions, which we probably won't get through all of them, but we'll try and see what we can get to. And I'll type these questions in the chat so folks can also have them there. All right, I'll bring us back just a minute earlier because it seemed like folks are already putting some of their thoughts and like ideas in the chat. Seems like there's a lot of inspiration, which is really amazing. I'm so excited to, hear that this has been like generative for folks and, seeing things like food for thought. Shalonda and Kristen, I don't know how we want to handle the questions. I can read, one out loud and, whoever wants to pitch in, maybe we do it that way. Okay. Oh yeah, folks, I hadn't looked at them in a while. Folks wrote definitely some juicy responses. Okay, let me
Kristen speaking. Kamaria, and before we dive into questions, I also do want to share for folks who are here, right? Like if you have an answer, if you have resources, if you have things to share, please feel empowered to drop info in the chat. Please feel empowered to share your expertise. You know, we are New York based, so we can't answer every question. And I'm also sure that folks have tools and strategies that they've been employing to ensure the safety and well-being of the communities they work with. So please, please feel empowered to share as you can.
Yes, I love adding resources to our vast archive as well. So yes, please share those. Okay, I'll just start from this question from Sage that says, hello, thank you for this training and the work that you do. My question relates to the overlap with educational program. I'm currently working on that covers how gender dysphoria can be weaponized in DV and IPV situations. The overlap in question is how do we defend our clients from false accusations of abuse for allowing and supporting someone who is exploring their gender identity? I live in Tennessee, where laws are purposely vague about providing gender affirming resources of any kind to minors. This seems to have been done purposely, so claims can be made over something as simple as allowing a child or teen to explore clothing options. Anyone want to hop in first with that one? That's a really good, amazing question, Sage.
Kristen speaking. So I think it depends on the context, right? And I think one of the biggest thing that we can do for the communities we work with is provide information, right? Providing information about what the law is, ensuring that parents and young people know, right, that the law is vague, that folks know that there is kind of that the parameters around what is targeted under this law, making sure folks have that information. And then I think also like speaking to folks you work with and coming up for strategies, right? Like what if family policing agents were to contact you? Like what is kind of like a collaborative kind of like safety plan that you can work with someone who could potentially be targeted by laws and by child policing agents who are responding to reports specifically related to allowing young people to affirm their gender identity, I think is one way to approach kind of making sure that folks at least know that you're a supportive resource.
I'll also add into finding out what local organizations are doing legal work around this and connecting with them, and figuring out how they are fighting back against these laws, right? Because behind the scenes, what a lot of people don't know is that your local ACLUs or legal organizations are trying to file class actions and all those things, or they have toolkits for folks around like doxing and safety and all of that. So I would say I don't know the landscape in Tennessee as far as the folks who are fighting back against this, but doing some research around who are the organizations or the states adjacent to Tennessee who are doing the legal work and the framework in order to protect people's rights, even when states have instituted laws that are in direct violation of human rights. So I would say that like vetting those spaces, because a lot of these people like don't have major websites and all of that, right? But they are doing a lot of work on the ground and a lot of grassroots and building small, cohorts of fighters, and small and comrade spaces where you can find that support group, you can find, someone to talk to. There's always someone around, and it may not just be glaring at us from a Google search. And so I would say maybe do a little bit, more digging with that landscape and maybe thinking outside of Tennessee too, which is like close by. What's the states that are close by? You may be able to find some resources where people will come into the state to support. So I would suggest that what are some out of the box maybe framing, or even some will be quote unquote adult organizations that may want to get into youth activism and all of that. And in figuring out if there's some work to be done around that, and some know your rights pieces for families.
All right, the next question we have, can you talk about reporting child sexual abuse and the role of sexual assault advocacy agencies in perpetuating family policing? So immediately, I can, jump in with this question first, but I think about, once again, Just Beginnings Collaborative, who is literally holding, crafting approaches and responses that are holistic and within community. And one of the things that we've recently, over the past year, been working with a couple of Columbia students, a part of their social justice lab, is to answer this very question. And one of the things that has come up for childhood sexual assault survivors is that regardless of the abuse, they would have wanted to have been close with their family, or still have been able to remain with some sort of contact, right? Which is not going to be the answer across the board, but like, how do we honor that choice of survivors while also making sure that like safety is held in that moment? There's also been a lot of work, transformative justice work, and using healing circles as a model of being able to talk about the harm that has occurred. There's some really good rates on how that's worked specifically in the sexual violence space. And so thinking about those creative approaches that like Shalana was even just talking about, like what would it look to pull a family to one side and say, hey, like, there's knowledge of this thing happened, like here are the options that like we can support and provide, and then seeing, right, how that could operate versus like immediate call that, especially when young people are disclosing, right? And then we're just kind of like, okay, let's make this call. And then they're like, whoa, I no longer live with any of my loved ones. Or, are there other outside family members? Is there like, part of their chosen family that for a little while that young person could stay with, right? Just like all the other solutions and questions that we're not necessarily asking. So I'd say like check out Just Beginnings, because they have a lot of like toolkits around the same question. But Shalonda, Kristen, anything specifically related to that y'all are thinking of?
No, I mean, I think that you pinpointed that. I think that with this specifically, the topic that most people avoid, right? Or only ACS is the only option, right? Because I don't want, it's too touchy of a subject to get into. So let me just call the authorities. And honestly, it disrupts their whole entire life. And not saying that this is not an important issue, because it absolutely is, but how can we approach this with the least amount of harm from our end, right? So it's going to be that transparency. It's going to be working with them to find. ACS always comes in and says, we're going to find a supportive resource. Well, could that have happened before the involvement? Like, why couldn't the resource have been found before? Why couldn't the mapping been done before? Why couldn't you ask the youth, well, do you have anyone in your life, beforehand? So I think that if you are the mandated reporter, you can do that framework without doing that, unless it's one of those emergencies where it is what you have to do. But I think that a lot of the things that we're leaving for these state agencies to do, this is what social work was actually about, and what it actually is. It's not putting off what somebody else can do. It's really digging into being a part of the community you decided to work in. So yeah, I would piggyback on what you said, but also just being connected. There's like no connection. There's no community. And so being that resource for someone.
And to Shalana's point, so much of this can happen, like some of this is also just discussion, preventative discussion around bodies, around consent, around autonomy, around agency. And, as someone's family who is, deep Southern roots, those are like taboo topics that were hard to talk about and still don't get talked about. And some of, right, especially related to childhood sexual abuse is able to operate in that secrecy, right? Because it's not things that we talk about. So like, even just sharing about consent as a model, about, sexuality and all of those things can even be helpful in like uplifting, before we even get there, before any harm even occurs. Other question is in regards to the work of DCS and CPS investigators, why are we not going in and helping fill these needs when the call is in relation to food or other resources instead of removals? Yeah.
We don't know. If it was us actually on the other end of the call, and it was actually filtering into our actual communities and not filtering into a central state in upward New York or someplace. Like, these things are not they're not handled in a way with community in mind, right? And so to me, clause like that should directly be filtered through a community-based organization that can directly say, oh, the family lives here. Let me call them and see if they need a bag of groceries or a gift card. Here, let's do this. If they need laundry services, here in New York, I was on Instagram one day and there was a laundromat in Harlem that said on Saturday from 12 a.m. to 12 p.m., you can come do your laundry for free, no questions asked, right? So it's like, why aren't we going into, our local businesses and stating, how much can we allocate for this? How much can we allocate for that? Like, everybody's like in this box of carcerality and policing. And it's like, no one's thinking like, oh yeah, I could go to my local grocer and ask them for a monthly stipend for this, right? Like, they're not doing that. And so we don't know why they're not, because we've been stating these things for decades. So I think it's an opportunity for us as community cross states to function in that way, right? I think we have to reclaim the narrative and pull that back and push back, right, at our local city councils, our local, county council meetings, and go and talk about these things, right? Because I think while we're talking about infrastructure and a new road and all of these things, no one is talking about the actual harms that are happening on a local level. We can talk about what our federal government is not doing. We can talk about what our state government is not doing, and even in our city governments. But locally, we have local council people that we need to roll up on and pull up on, because they have discretionary funding and money, and we need to continuously roll up on them around these topics of why we're allowing this to happen. Like, I don't know how it works in other states, but in New York, we know that these agencies are not in our most affluent parts of our city, right? Their buildings are situated in our neighborhoods to surveil us in the way that they are, and to perpetuate this narrative that we are not taking care of our communities. When I on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I know I can roll to this church and that church and I can do these things. So the most that they do is give a list of food pantries, but what if there's access needed for transportation? Like, it's just the way that they do things. We wouldn't do it that way, but we don't work for them. And so this is the work that we do on the opposite end to support others in reimagining what support looks like. And we don't have to rely on them to create these things. We can do these things ourselves.
I think so much of what you're saying right now, too, Shalana, is just like having the audacity to be like, no, we can demand this thing. To your point about pulling up, that's something we started doing at the end of last year. And the electeds were scared, y'all. Like, they were scared. They were calling each other around. They were like, oh my gosh, this group of parents, JMACForFamilies, rallied outside this office. Like, they were pointing the finger of who's the person that dropped the ball. And it's like, if we apply pressure, they're scared, right? We know people have the power. So like, when Shalana said pull up, like, no, like literally, not figuratively, like actually like going out to those places. Really quickly, I want to, amplify what Sage is saying in the chat as a thank you to our ASL interpreters, Sean, Flo, and Hercules, who are, absolutely amazing and have been so wonderful today. So yes, I agree. Thank you to y'all. Other things in the chat, someone is asking specifically if we can share some stats on undocumented communities and the intersections of mandated reporting. That's probably something we can do on the back end and like send out to Emil and team to send to y'all. So if that's okay, Katie, we'll go ahead and share that after this. There was another, any advice for folks who are mandated reporters with supervisor who are very defensive about CPS and think they do great work and is of the mindset that when in doubt, make the report? I mean, my first thought is to just simply start introducing information, right? Like, you're not making the data up. We're not making up the data about these systems failing, right? So like, even, at your staff meeting, slowly starting to be like, I went to this like webinar, or I seen this, JMACForFamilies team or CFR, like I just saw this thing around town. Like, I want to talk about it, right? Because yeah, sometimes coming in hot in the way of like, when someone's already defensive, it's like they're already not in the mode to hear what you're saying. They're already not trying to resonate with the message. And so I think concrete data, I dropped several of the links that like Shalonda was talking about, that Kristen was talking about. We have a whole storytelling link on our website that I'll drop in a second, where you can hear impacted voices, impacted folks who are part of this movement. So that would be like my initial advice. I don't know if other folks, have anything different, but
I'll add in too, the group Mandated Reporters Against Mandated Reporting. Their Instagram is Beyond Reporting. We can also send some other Instagram pages that you all can follow, because again, from state to state is different. And then there's like nationally some pages. And I haven't been to one in a while. I'm not a mandated reporter, but I know that they talk about strategies in coalition building within their schools, within where their places their work, how to approach their direct supervisors or their administrators, in trying to approach things differently. Because even though people are mandated reporters, they may have a support of a principal. I know a few schools here that don't approach support in that way. They refuse to call ACS on any of their families, because even though you are technically a mandated reporter, you don't have to in that way, right? Mandated reporting is about funding, right? It's literally about funding. New York gets $4 million for mandated reporting. And so we had a hearing here regarding, well, should we even, 4 million is a drop in the bucket to New York. Like, why are we even doing this mandated reporting thing? The money is not worth it with all this harm that is happening. So is it even worth even continuously receiving these funds for men? Everything about this is about money. Let's keep it 100% funky. It is about the capitalism of Black and brown bodies. And if dollars walk in harming communities, dollars will walk in harming communities, right? And so it's not really about that, right? It's not really about support. It's like, okay, this federal government will give you more money for calling these people. You know what? Go call on the Black and brown people. That's literally what it is. So again, mandated reporters against mandated reporting. There's also abolition of social workers, which is another national organization. I would say start a book club and start with the 4 or 5 books that I dropped in the chat, right? Just getting people to understand the history that they're upholding, because a lot of people walk through here and just do what they're told, status quo all day long, and have no fundamental understanding of why their beliefs are what they are, because they've been told to operate in this way. So maybe a book club is the start of like examining, your state's legal situation around this, but also understanding the country's climate around this. And those couple of books that I shared with you all could be a start. That's like 5 months of continuous, reading and conversations and discussions and reimagining. Oh, Up in Movement is a great resource. They have a podcast as well. So maybe sharing podcasts. There are a couple of family defense podcasts that I've seen on Spotify as well, and legal podcasts. So there's a lot of information out there in shifting the narrative around this.
I think we probably have time for like 2 more questions. One I'll answer.
Yeah, I don't want to skip the ones that are in the question and answer. We have a few about there is a transgender minor living with violently conservative parents. I think that's one that we should try to somewhat answer. Many, it says many next steps involve CPS coming and talking to the parents, and in some states they're actually forbidden from talking to the minor without the parent consent, which is incredibly dehumanizing to these young people. I mean, it's never going to be a blanket answer, right? And what could support this student, knowing what that student's goals are, because I could say, yeah, you want to leave, I got you, let's leave, right? But is that their actual goal, right? Is it the goal that they want to go to therapy with their family and have some supportive mediation with their family? I think we can't answer it in like the framework of do this, but I think finding out exactly the goal of what this minor would like and what the outcomes and they want, and work that way, finding organizations within the state that you're in. I know here we have Hetrick Martin, we have the Trevor Project. Nationally, those are some of the things, but maybe it's housing support that they need to move themselves out of the situation. Forge here, right? Can provide what actually the student wants, and then working that way, and then finding local spaces to support them.
Kristen speaking. I just also wanted to add, like, talking to that young person about potential community people that they trust. Is there a relative you trust? Is there a friend you trust, a family friend that you trust? Is there someone that we can also reach out to and maybe have a collaborative meeting where we can come up with some of this planning together, to help you feel safe and supported, and maybe having a conversation with your parents? Though I agree with Shalonda, it really depends. Like, the question starts with what are this young person's goals?
Then there's another one about a neighbor, right? We hear this often too. Is verbally abusive, occasionally physically abusive. The children are 2 and 3, and she's a single mother. You said you've already made a few mandated calls, but the calls have not been screened. So my question would be, have you connected with the mom personally? Like, how have you been supportive in that way, without necessarily going for the jugular of you abuse your children, X, Y, and Z? If there's an emergency, there's an emergency. I'm not stopping people from seeking support in an emergency situation. I'm not saying that. But how have you connected neighborly, right? What sort of supports do you think they particularly need? Is it babysitting? Right? Like, what is it? Like, it could just be that. Have you built a trust with that neighbor to be able to be a resource to them? And really be and humanize the situation. And then you go from there, and then there's just resources. What else can we offer? Is it you cooked one night and you drop it off to build that trust in that situation? I'm not quite sure, and I'm not trying to negate what you're saying that person is doing, but sometimes some of it is relative, right? Like, parents yell, and I'm not trying to say people use cuss words. I really honestly do get that. I don't feel that they should be cussing at a 2 and a 3-year-old, but I do feel that we have to be aware of, like, our biases when it comes to certain things, and how are we humanizing ourselves, how are we humanizing the parent, and how are we really connecting beyond the 4 walls that disconnect us.
I think those were thank you, Shalana, too, because I didn't even see some of those. So I think, given time, that is what we have for folks today. You'll get the slides afterwards. Here are more ways to stay involved. Shalonda's mentioned some, Kristen's mentioned some. Thank you, everyone, for sharing space with us. I don't know, Shalonda, Kristen, if there's anything else but mine is just thank you. Amazing. Emil?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. You'll get an evaluation when you leave the meeting. Please fill that out and send us any questions you have, so we can get you, keep getting you these resources. And so much thank you to interpreters and to Kamaria and Shalonda and Kristen. This was wonderful. Take care, everyone.